There are stories born from silence and raised in shadows, fed by questions that were never answered and wounds that never fully healed. This is one of those stories, the saga of a man who returns to where it all began, carrying 20 years of pain and a thirst for truth that can no longer be ignored. In a small Alabama town where secrets are buried deeper than the dead in the local cemetery, Carl Edwards is about to discover that some truths are too dangerous to remain hidden. Carl is no longer the 5-year-old boy who lost his parents in an accident that never made sense. Now he's a successful Chicago attorney, but beneath the expensive suit and professional confidence, there's still that orphan who grew up with unanswered questions. Millbrook, the town he left behind, seems to have prospered in his absence. Clean streets, thriving businesses, a perfect facade of southern tranquility. But Carl knows appearances can be deceiving, and there's something in the air of this town that awakens all his instincts as an experienced lawyer. What began as a simple visit to his parents' grave quickly transforms into something far more sinister and complex. Every strange conversation, every nervous glance, every name whispered in the shadows points to a truth that was carefully buried along with Sarah and David Whitfield. Carl will discover that his parents weren't just local journalists. They were investigators who were dangerously close to exposing something that very powerful people would do anything to keep secret. This is a story about justice and revenge, about the price of truth and the power of determination. It's about a man who must choose between the peace of mind that comes from ignorance and the devastating responsibility that comes with knowledge. Carl is about to discover that some battles don't end with death. They just wait for the next generation to continue them. And in Millbrook, where past and present are intertwined like ancient roots, the truth is about to emerge from the shadows, no matter how many powerful people try to keep it buried. You know that feeling when something doesn't add up when you return home after a long time? Carl Edwards felt exactly that when he stepped foot in Millbrook, Alabama, again after 20 long years. The guy had built an entire life in Chicago, became a respected attorney, but always carried a wound that wouldn't heal properly. At 28, he finally gathered the courage to do what he should have done long ago, visit his parents' grave. The investigation he didn't know he was starting was already showing its first signs. It was as if fate had prepared this moment carefully, every detail in the right place. Carl had no idea that simple trip would turn into a quest for truth. The anger he felt for growing up without parents was about to find a real target. The crime that destroyed his childhood was waiting to be discovered, and it would all begin with a simple visit to the cemetery. The road leading to Millbrook seemed longer than he remembered, full of curves that awakened fragmented childhood memories. Carl drove his black sedan slowly, observing every house, every tree, trying to recognize something familiar. The town had that southern charm that makes anyone feel at home, but there was also something in the air that made him uneasy. The houses were well maintained, the gardens immaculate, and everything seemed too perfect to be true. It was the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are kept behind polite smiles. Carl felt he was being watched, even before speaking to anyone. The fraud that shaped his entire life was hidden in those quiet streets. He didn't know yet, but his revenge against injustice was about to begin. The investigation of his own history was in his hands. The motel where Carl stayed was at the town's entrance, a simple but clean place, one of those that still has real keys instead of cards. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s, was friendly until he mentioned he was visiting the local cemetery. Her smile withered immediately and she began nervously shuffling papers on the desk. "Are you related to someone buried there?" she asked, and Carl noticed the question carried strange weight. When he said he was the Whitfields' son, the woman went pale as if she'd seen a ghost. It was obvious that name meant something to her, something that wasn't good. The anger Carl felt for growing up an orphan began mixing with curiosity. There was something about his parents that people knew and he didn't. The crime that destroyed his family had left marks on that town. The next day, Carl walked through Millbrook's main streets, observing how the town functioned. It was impressive how everything revolved around the Blackwood factory, a family that apparently controlled half the local jobs. Campaign posters for Jonathan Blackwood, the mayor, were scattered everywhere, promising progress and prosperity. Carl noticed how people spoke the Blackwood name with a mixture of respect and fear, as if they were kings of a small kingdom. The investigation he didn't know he was conducting began taking shape when he realized the Blackwoods were mentioned in every conversation. It was strange how one family could have so much power in a small town. The fraud he didn't yet know about was connected to those names he heard everywhere. His revenge against the injustice that destroyed his childhood was taking a specific direction. The anger he felt was beginning to find focus. Millbrook Cemetery sat on a gentle hill, surrounded by ancient oaks that provided welcoming shade. Carl walked among the headstones until he found what he was looking for: Sarah and David Whitfield Whitfield, beloved parents and dedicated journalists. He stood there for a long time trying to feel some connection with those people he barely knew. The flowers he brought seemed too small before the enormity of what he had lost. It was strange how his parents' death seemed so distant yet so present in that moment. Carl wondered what kind of people they were, what stories they had to tell. The investigation of his own origins was beginning there, in that silent place. The crime that took them from his life was buried with them, but not forever. The fraud that shaped his destiny was about to be discovered. His quest for revenge against injustice was just beginning. When Carl returned to town, he decided to have lunch at the only restaurant that seemed busy, a place called Magnolia Diner. The food was good, but what really caught his attention were the conversations around him. People talked about the old days, about how the town was different before, and whenever someone mentioned the 90s, the tone got quieter. Carl realized there was an invisible line dividing Millbrook's history, before and after something nobody wanted to talk about openly. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Linda, was kind but visibly uncomfortable when he said his last name. Whitfield. Haven't heard that name around here in a while, she murmured, avoiding his gaze. The anger Carl felt for growing up without answers began transforming into determination. The investigation he was unknowingly conducting gained more urgency with each strange conversation. That night, Carl lay awake in his motel room, looking out the window at the town's lights. Millbrook seemed peaceful under the starry sky, but he knew something was hidden in that tranquility. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave him, as if his presence had awakened something that had been sleeping for a long time. Carl began understanding that his return wasn't just a sentimental visit. It was the beginning of something bigger. The fraud that destroyed his family was buried somewhere in that town, waiting to be discovered. His revenge against the injustice that made him an orphan was taking shape, even though he didn't yet know exactly how. The crime that changed his entire life was about to be investigated by the very orphan who survived. The anger he felt for growing up without parents finally had purpose, and tomorrow he would begin searching for the answers he deserved to have 20 years ago. Millbrook's registry office was in an old building downtown, one of those with wooden floors that creak with every step and tall windows that let dust dance in the sunlight. Carl entered thinking it would be a quick, simple visit, get his parents' death certificates and that's it. But you know how it is, right? Sometimes life has other plans for us. The clerk who helped him was Eleanor Hayes, a woman in her 70s who had worked there for decades, knew everyone, and kept the town's secrets like a walking vault. When Carl introduced himself and requested the documents, she stopped what she was doing and looked at him as if she'd seen a ghost. The investigation he didn't know he was conducting had just taken a giant leap. The anger he felt for growing up an orphan was about to find a very specific reason. The crime that destroyed his family had left traces, and Eleanor knew it. The fraud that shaped his entire life was stored in those dusty files. Eleanor stood frozen for what seemed like an eternity, holding the papers in trembling hands as if they were bombs about to explode. "Whitfield," she murmured, and Carl saw recognition in her eyes mixed with something that looked like fear. "I thought all the Whitfields had disappeared," she let slip, immediately regretting having spoken. Carl felt a chill run up his spine. What the hell did she mean by disappeared? The woman began nervously shuffling papers, clearly trying to decide whether or not to hand over the documents. It was obvious she knew something that went far beyond a simple car accident. The revenge Carl didn't know he wanted was beginning to take shape. The investigation of his own history was gaining a darker tone. The fraud he didn't yet know about was written on those papers Eleanor hesitated to deliver. The anger he felt was beginning to find a specific target. When Eleanor finally handed over the certificates, Carl noticed her hands trembled slightly. He thanked her and left the registry, but something about the woman's behavior deeply bothered him. He sat on a bench in the square across the street and began examining the documents with the attention of the experienced lawyer he was. Right away, something caught his attention. The dates didn't match up. According to the papers, his parents died on a Thursday, but Carl vaguely remembered attending the funeral on a Saturday. It might seem trivial, but for someone who works with legal documents, inconsistencies like that are giant red flags. The investigation he was unknowingly conducting had just gained concrete evidence. The crime he suspected had happened was beginning to show its first clues. The fraud was there, written in black and white, waiting to be discovered. His revenge against the injustice that made him an orphan now had a solid starting point. But what really made Carl freeze was seeing the witness signatures on the document. There were the names he'd heard throughout the town: Harrison Blackwood and Robert Kane, the current retired judge. Why the hell were two of Millbrook's most powerful people witnessing the death of two simple journalists. It made no sense at all, unless Carl felt anger grow in his chest like a fire someone had just thrown gasoline on. The investigation he was conducting took a completely new direction at that moment. It was obvious something was very wrong with his parents' death, something involving the town's most influential people. The fraud that shaped his entire life was connected to the Blackwoods, the family that controlled Millbrook. The crime that made him an orphan hadn't been an accident. It had been something much worse. His revenge against injustice finally had specific faces and names. The truth was beginning to reveal itself, and it was much more sinister than he imagined. Carl returned to the registry at the end of the day, when Eleanor was closing. The woman was visibly nervous seeing him again, as if she knew he had discovered something. "Mrs. Hayes," he said in the calmest voice he could manage, "I need to talk to you about my parents." Eleanor looked around, making sure no one was nearby, and signaled for him to enter quickly. "I knew someday someone from the family would return," she whispered, and Carl realized the investigation he was conducting was going to be much deeper than he imagined. The fraud he suspected had happened was real, and Eleanor had information about it. The anger he felt for growing up an orphan was about to find very concrete justifications. The crime that destroyed his family had witnesses, and one of them was right there in front of him. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was about to gain unexpected allies. "Your parents were good people," Eleanor said, looking out the window as if expecting to see someone watching. "Honest journalists, you know, the kind of people who don't accept bribes and don't turn a blind eye to wrongdoing." Carl felt his heart race. His parents were investigative journalists, not just local newspaper reporters as he'd always thought. They were investigating some irregularities at City Hall, strange contracts, money that went missing. Eleanor continued, and Carl realized his parents' investigation had cost them their lives. The fraud they discovered was the motive for the crime that killed them. The anger Carl felt began transforming into something more focused, more dangerous. His revenge against the injustice that made him an orphan now had a clear direction. The truth about his parents' death was beginning to be revealed, and it involved corruption, power, and murder. Eleanor knew more things, and Carl was determined to discover everything. When Carl left the registry that night, he was no longer the same man who had arrived in Millbrook just looking to make peace with the past. The investigation that began as a simple search for documents had transformed into a hunt for the truth about a crime that destroyed his family. The fraud his parents discovered cost them their lives, and now Carl knew it hadn't been an accident. The anger he felt for growing up an orphan had found a very specific purpose: to seek justice for parents who were murdered for doing their job right. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was just beginning, but now he knew exactly who he was fighting against. The Blackwoods had blood on their hands, and Carl was determined to prove it. The truth was buried somewhere in Millbrook, and he was going to unearth it, no matter the price. The investigation Carl was conducting gained an urgency he'd never felt before, not even in the most complex cases he'd handled in Chicago. He spent the entire night in his motel room, analyzing every detail of the death certificates, taking notes and trying to connect the dots. The fraud his parents discovered was beginning to take shape in his mind, like a macabre puzzle someone had tried to hide for 20 years. Carl knew he needed more evidence, more witnesses, more anything that would prove his parents' death hadn't been accidental. The anger he felt for growing up an orphan was transforming into a thirst for justice that consumed his every thought. The crime that destroyed his family had been carefully covered up, but Carl had an advantage. He was a lawyer, knew how to investigate, how to find loopholes in the system. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was becoming a professional mission, and he was determined to discover the whole truth, no matter how many powerful people he had to face. The next morning, Carl decided to look for Betty Morrison, his father's former secretary that Eleanor had mentioned. He found her address in the phone book. Betty lived in a simple house on Millbrook's outskirts, away from the busy downtown. When she opened the door and saw Carl, the reaction was immediate. Tears in her eyes and a tight hug, as if she were seeing David Whitfield himself, resurrected. "I knew someday you'd come back," she said, and Carl realized the investigation he was conducting had a very valuable ally. Betty had kept secrets for 2 decades, waiting for someone from the family to appear to hear the truth. The fraud his parents discovered was documented, hidden in her attic like dangerous treasure. The anger Carl felt began mixing with hope. Finally, he would have answers. The crime that made him an orphan was about to be exposed in all its sordid details. His revenge against the injustice that destroyed his family was gaining real ammunition. Betty led Carl to the attic, where there was a dusty cardboard box marked only with the initials DW. Inside, Carl found what appeared to be his father's personal investigation file: photographs, documents, handwritten notes, and even recordings on old cassette tapes. "Your father was meticulous," Betty explained. "He documented everything, always said the truth needed solid evidence. Carl began examining the material and felt a chill. His parents weren't just local journalists. They were serious investigators who had discovered a gigantic corruption scheme. The investigation they were conducting involved fraudulent contracts, bribery of authorities, and deliberate environmental destruction. The fraud they discovered went far beyond simple administrative irregularities. It was an entire organized crime system, with the Blackwoods at the center of everything. The anger Carl felt transformed into pure indignation. His parents died because they were too honest. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life now had concrete evidence to support it. The recordings Carl found in the box were devastating. He heard his own father's voice documenting secret meetings, intercepted phone conversations, and testimonies from public officials who had been bribed. Harrison Blackwood appeared in several recordings, offering money in exchange for inflated contracts and fraudulent environmental permits. Jonathan Blackwood, who at the time was just the patriarch's son, was also involved, serving as an intermediary in the dirtiest negotiations. Carl realized his parents' investigation had come dangerously close to exposing the entire corruption network. The fraud they discovered involved millions of dollars diverted from public coffers over the years. The crime that cost them their lives wasn't passionate. It was calculated, cold, executed to protect an empire built on lies. The anger Carl felt intensified hearing his father's voice, so familiar even after so much time. His revenge against the injustice that made him an orphan now had faces, voices, and irrefutable proof. Betty showed Carl the last notes David Whitfield made before dying. He was planning to publish everything, she explained, had even scheduled a meeting with a federal prosecutor to hand over the evidence. Carl read the notes with growing horror. His parents knew they were in danger, knew the Blackwoods were capable of anything to protect their dirty business. The investigation they were conducting had reached the point where there was no turning back. It was expose everything or be silenced forever. The fraud they discovered was so extensive it could bring down not just the Blackwoods, but Millbrook's entire political structure. Carl understood the crime that killed his parents wasn't an accident or an impulsive act. It was a planned execution to protect a criminal scheme. The anger he felt mixed with pride for the courageous parents he had. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was becoming a continuation of the work they had started. The truth they died trying to reveal would finally be exposed. Carl spent hours in Betty's attic, photographing documents, copying recordings, and assembling a dossier that would make any federal prosecutor drool. The investigation his parents conducted was so complete and detailed it seemed like a manual on how to dismantle a corruption scheme. Betty told him David and Sarah knew they were being watched in their final weeks of life, that they had changed their routine and started meeting in different places. They knew time was running out, she said, but they didn't want to give up because they knew other families were being harmed by the Blackwoods' greed. The fraud they exposed involved not just public money, but also the community's health. The Blackwood factories had been dumping toxic waste into the local river for years. The crime that cost them their lives was committed to protect not just fortunes, but a lifestyle built on other people's suffering. The anger Carl felt transformed into iron determination. His revenge against the injustice that made him an orphan would also be justice for the entire town that suffered at the Blackwoods' hands. When Carl left Betty's house that afternoon, he carried more than evidence. He carried a mission. The investigation that began as a personal search for answers had transformed into a crusade for the justice his parents died trying to achieve. The fraud they discovered was even more extensive than he imagined, involving decades of crimes that affected hundreds of families in Millbrook. Carl realized the crime that made him an orphan was just the tip of the iceberg of a much larger scheme. The anger he felt for growing up without parents was now directed against an entire system of corruption that needed to be brought down. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life would also be redemption for his parents' memory and liberation for an entire town. The Blackwoods had controlled Millbrook for too long, and Carl was about to strike the first real blow against their empire. The war for truth was just beginning, but now he had the necessary weapons to win. Carl knew the time had come to emerge from the shadows and face the demons that had haunted his family for 2 decades. The investigation he conducted had gathered enough evidence to bring down an entire government, but he wanted more than legal justice. He wanted to look into the eyes of the men who destroyed his childhood and see the fear they felt when they killed his parents. The annual charity dinner at Millbrook Country Club would be the perfect stage for this confrontation. It was the town's most important social event, where all the local elite gathered to celebrate their own importance. Harrison Blackwood Blackwood would be there, surrounded by the same accomplices who helped him cover up the crime all these years. The fraud they committed would be exposed in front of all the society they deceived. The anger Carl felt for growing up an orphan would finally find its outlet. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was about to become public and devastating. Carl bought a tuxedo and prepared like a gladiator preparing for the arena. He knew there would be no going back after that night. Either he would manage to expose the truth or the Blackwoods would find a way to silence him like they did his parents. The investigation he conducted had to be presented in a way that couldn't be contested or ignored. Carl recorded a copy of all evidence and sent it to 3 different journalists in big cities with instructions to publish everything if something happened to him. It was an insurance policy against the same fate his parents had. The fraud the Blackwoods committed would be exposed no matter what happened that night. The crime that made him an orphan wouldn't go unpunished any longer. The anger he felt transformed into calculated coldness. He was an experienced lawyer about to present the most important case of his life. His revenge against the injustice that destroyed his family would be served cold, as it should be. Millbrook Country Club was exactly what Carl expected. Ostentation disguised as tradition, wealth displayed as if it were virtue. He entered the main hall and saw Harrison Blackwood at the center of attention, a 70-year-old man who still commanded the room like a king in his castle. Jonathan Blackwood stood beside his father, smiling and greeting people like the experienced politician he was. Carl observed the 2 men who destroyed his life, feeling months of investigation condensing into that moment of imminent confrontation. The fraud they committed was about to be exposed in front of all the accomplices and beneficiaries of the scheme. He walked through the room, greeting people, introducing himself as a Chicago lawyer visiting the town. The crime that cost his parents their lives would finally be judged by the court of public opinion. The anger Carl felt was controlled, channeled, ready to explode at the right moment. His revenge against the injustice that made him an orphan would be epic and unforgettable. When it was time for speeches, Carl stood up and asked for the floor. The master of ceremonies, not knowing who he was, allowed him to speak. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Carl began, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "My name is Carl Edwards, but you might know me better as Carl Whitfield, son of Sarah and David Whitfield." The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear a pin drop. Carl saw Harrison Blackwood pale and Jonathan shift uncomfortably in his chair. The investigation he conducted was about to be presented in the most dramatic way possible. "My parents were journalists who died 20 years ago investigating corruption in this town," he continued, and felt tension grow in the air like electricity before a storm. The fraud the Blackwoods committed was being exposed in front of all the elite who benefited from it. The crime that made him an orphan finally had a public prosecutor. The anger he felt transformed into pure power. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was happening in real time. Carl pulled from his pocket a folder with copies of the evidence he found and began distributing them to the nearest guests. "These are photographs, recordings, and documents that prove Harrison and Jonathan Blackwood murdered my parents to cover up a corruption scheme that stole millions of dollars from this town." The chaos that followed was immediate. People standing up, whispered conversations, shocked looks directed at the main table where the Blackwoods sat. The investigation Carl conducted was being validated by the panic reactions he saw around him. Harrison tried to stand up to speak, but Carl wasn't finished. "My parents discovered that you bribed authorities, defrauded public contracts, and poisoned this town's river for decades. The fraud the Blackwoods committed was being exposed in all its sordid details. The crime that cost his parents their lives finally had a public prosecutor." The anger Carl felt transformed into satisfaction, seeing desperation in the murderer's eyes. His revenge against the injustice that made him an orphan was being served in front of all Millbrook society. Jonathan Blackwood tried to take control of the situation, standing up and speaking in an authoritative tone. "These are unfounded accusations from a man clearly disturbed by the loss of his parents." But Carl was prepared for this. He had spent years in courtrooms, knew how to deal with attempts to discredit evidence. "Mr. Blackwood," he responded calmly, "can you explain why your signature appears as a witness on my parents' death certificate? Why would a businessman and a politician be present at the scene of an accident involving 2 journalists who were investigating them?" The investigation Carl conducted had anticipated every possible defense the Blackwoods would try to use. The room was in absolute silence, everyone waiting for an answer that never came. The fraud they committed was being dismantled piece by piece in front of all the accomplices. The crime that destroyed Carl's family was being judged by the most important court, public opinion. The anger he felt mixed with pride. His parents would be proud to see the truth finally being exposed. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was reaching the climax he had dreamed of for months. The dilemma Carl faced at that moment was more complex than he had imagined. He had the evidence, had the attention of the entire town, had the Blackwoods cornered like rats. But looking around the hall, he saw faces of ordinary people who depended on the jobs the Blackwood family family provided. The investigation he conducted revealed not just crimes but also a complicated economic reality. Millbrook depended almost entirely on Blackwood businesses to survive. Exposing the whole truth would mean not just justice for his parents, but also the economic collapse of an entire town. The fraud the Blackwoods committed had roots so deep that pulling them out could kill the entire tree. Carl realized the crime that made him an orphan was intertwined with the livelihood of hundreds of innocent families. The anger he felt mixed with responsibility. He had the power to destroy his parents' murderers, but also to harm people who weren't guilty of anything. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was becoming a moral dilemma he hadn't anticipated. Carl made the hardest decision of his life that night at the club. He wouldn't stop halfway. The investigation he conducted deserved to be known by the entire country, not just by Millbrook's elite who were more concerned with protecting their own interests. The next morning he called 3 major television networks and 2 national newspapers, offering a story that would make any investigative journalist salivate. Corruption, murder, and decades of crimes covered up in a small Alabama town. The fraud the Blackwoods committed was too big to stay hidden within Millbrook's limits. Carl knew that exposing everything publicly would bring devastating consequences, but the anger he felt for growing up an orphan wouldn't allow him to make concessions with justice. The crime that cost his parents their lives would be known by millions of people, no matter what price the town had to pay. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was about to become a national case. Truth had a price, and Carl was willing to pay it in full. The reaction was faster and more brutal than Carl expected. In less than 48 hours, the first reports began being broadcast, and Millbrook became the center of national attention in a way nobody wanted. Jonathan Blackwood, who always prided himself on being a skilled and controlled politician, couldn't handle the pressure. The investigation Carl made public destroyed not just his reputation, but also any hope of continuing in politics. On the third night after the exposure, Jonathan was found dead in the mayor's office, with a confession letter beside his body. The fraud he helped perpetuate for decades had finally consumed him completely. Carl read the confession with mixed feelings. He had gotten the admission of guilt he wanted, but the price was a human life. The crime that destroyed his family now had one more victim, and he wondered if his revenge was worth so much suffering. The anger he felt began mixing with something he didn't expect: remorse. Jonathan's confession was like a nuclear bomb exploding in Millbrook. He not only admitted involvement in Carl's parents' murder, but also implicated other important town figures: Sheriff Tom Bradley, who helped cover up the evidence, and Judge Robert Kane, who ensured no serious investigation was conducted at the time. The investigation Carl initiated was spreading like wildfire, consuming the entire power structure that had controlled the town for decades. The fraud the Blackwoods orchestrated had tentacles in every important institution in Millbrook. Carl watched the news as one by one, accomplices were arrested or resigned from their positions. The crime that made him an orphan was being avenged more completely than he ever dreamed. But the anger he felt was being replaced by a strange sense of emptiness. The revenge he sought for so long was happening, but it didn't bring the peace he expected. His war against the injustice that shaped his entire life was being won, but the battlefield was full of wreckage. What Carl didn't expect was to find an unexpected ally in the midst of chaos: Rebecca Blackwood, Jonathan's daughter and Harrison's granddaughter. She sought out Carl at the motel where he was staying, carrying a box of documents that made his eyes light up. "I always knew there was something wrong in our family," she said, "and I kept evidence for years, waiting for the right moment to use it." The investigation Carl conducted gained a completely new dimension with the documents Rebecca brought. They were original contracts, bank records, and even photographs showing the criminal scheme in operation. The fraud the Blackwoods committed was even more extensive than Carl imagined, involving state politicians and businessmen from other towns. Rebecca revealed she always suspected her grandfather and father were capable of murder, and that Carl's parents' death was what convinced her to start collecting evidence. The crime that destroyed his family had created an enemy within the Blackwood family itself. The anger Carl felt began transforming into something more complex: respect for a woman who had the courage to betray her own family in the name of justice. But not everyone in Millbrook saw Carl as a hero. The national exposure of the Blackwoods crimes brought devastating economic consequences to the town. The factories were closed by environmental authorities, public contracts were canceled, and hundreds of people lost their jobs overnight. Carl began receiving death threats from people who blamed him for destroying their lives. The investigation he conducted had exposed the truth, but had also destroyed the only means of livelihood many families knew. The fraud the Blackwoods committed had become so fundamental to the local economy that removing it was like ripping out the town's heart. Carl walked through Millbrook streets and saw stores closing, families moving away, young people leaving in search of opportunities elsewhere. The crime that made him an orphan had been avenged, but the price was the destruction of an entire community. The anger he felt for growing up without parents was being replaced by guilt. He had achieved justice, but at what cost? His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was proving to be a bitter victory. Carl realized he had completely underestimated the impact his quest for justice would have on innocent people's lives. The investigation he conducted had been focused on exposing crimes and punishing criminals, but he hadn't thought about the consequences for those who depended on the corrupt system to survive. The fraud the Blackwoods committed had created jobs, even if illegally, and now these people were paying the price for the honesty Carl brought to town. He began understanding that justice isn't always simple, that sometimes doing the right thing brings suffering to people who don't deserve to suffer. The crime that cost his parents their lives had been avenged, but the revenge had created new victims. The anger he felt for growing up an orphan was being tempered by the complex reality that his actions had consequences that went far beyond his personal pain. His war against the injustice that shaped his entire life was being won, but he was beginning to question whether victory was worth the price others were paying. The truth had been exposed, but Carl was learning that not every truth brings only liberation. Sometimes it also brings destruction. Harrison Blackwood's trial was the most important event in Millbrook's history, broadcast live by the country's major television networks. Carl sat in the front row of the courtroom, watching the 70-year-old man who destroyed his family finally being held accountable for the crimes he committed. The investigation he conducted had resulted in convictions for murder, fraud, corruption, and a dozen other crimes that would earn life imprisonment for the Blackwood patriarch. When the judge read the sentence, Carl felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, a sense that justice really existed. The fraud the Blackwoods perpetrated for decades was being punished in the most severe way possible. The crime that made him an orphan finally had a definitive legal resolution, but the anger Carl had carried for so long was being replaced by something unexpected. It wasn't satisfaction from revenge, but rather a strange emptiness. His war against the injustice that shaped his entire life had been won, but now he needed to discover who he was without this anger that had defined him for 2 decades. The real victory wasn't in Harrison's imprisonment, but in the possibility of finally moving forward. Carl realized the revenge he sought for so long didn't bring the peace he expected. In fact, seeing Millbrook economically destroyed because of the investigation he conducted left him with a weight on his conscience he couldn't ignore. The fraud the Blackwoods committed had been exposed and punished, but hundreds of innocent families were paying the price for corruption they didn't even know existed. Carl began understanding that true justice wasn't just punishing the guilty, but also helping victims rebuild their lives. The crime that made him an orphan had created a cycle of suffering that extended far beyond his own pain. The anger he felt for growing up without parents was being transformed into something more constructive: social responsibility. His training as a lawyer and the resources he gained from the civil lawsuit against the Blackwoods could be used for something greater than personal revenge. The war against injustice that shaped his entire life was evolving from destruction to reconstruction. He had the power to help Millbrook rise from the ashes his quest for justice had created. The partnership with Rebecca Blackwood was the most positive surprise of this entire journey. She not only brought additional evidence that ensured her grandfather's conviction, but also proved to be a genuine ally in rebuilding the town. The investigation Carl conducted had revealed that Rebecca had been secretly documenting the family's crimes for years, waiting for an opportunity to do the right thing. Together, they created the Millbrook Development Fund, using confiscated Blackwood assets and civil lawsuit resources to establish new businesses in town. The fraud her family committed for decades would be compensated with legitimate investments in education, technology, and environmental sustainability. Carl discovered that working to build something positive was much more satisfying than simply destroying what was negative. The crime that destroyed his family had, ironically, created an opportunity to create something better for the future. The anger he carried for 20 years was being channeled into projects that would benefit future generations. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was transforming into a force of positive change his parents would be proud to see. Carl established a law office in Millbrook, specializing in defending workers and small business owners against abusive corporations. The investigation he conducted of the Blackwoods crimes had given him a national reputation as someone who wasn't afraid to face the powerful. Lawyers from across the country began seeking him out for consultations on corporate corruption and white-collar crime cases. The fraud he exposed in Millbrook became a case study in law schools, and Carl began giving lectures on how to investigate and prosecute corruption schemes. The crime that made him an orphan had transformed into a professional specialization that allowed him to help other victims of injustice. The anger he felt for growing up without parents was being used to protect other families from suffering the same fate. His war against the injustice that shaped his entire life had found a greater purpose, being a professional defender of the oppressed. Carl discovered that the best revenge against those who destroyed his family was using the pain they caused to prevent others from suffering similar injustices. Millbrook's transformation was slow but steady. The sustainable companies Carl and Rebecca established began generating clean, well-paying jobs, gradually replacing the corruption-based economy that existed before. The investigation Carl conducted had exposed not just crimes but also opportunities. The town had natural resources and a strategic location that could be exploited legally and beneficially. The fraud the Blackwoods perpetrated for decades had prevented Millbrook's real development, keeping the town dependent on illegal activities. Carl realized true justice wasn't just punishing criminals, but also releasing the potential they had suppressed. The crime that cost his parents their lives had paradoxically created an opportunity to build something better than what existed before. The anger he carried for 20 years was being replaced by hope that Millbrook could become an example of how a community can recover from corruption. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life was transforming into a story of collective redemption. Carl visited his parents' grave one last time before permanently moving to Millbrook. He placed fresh flowers on the headstone and spoke to them as if they were there, telling them about everything that had happened since he returned to town. The investigation he conducted had not only exposed their murderers, but also continued the journalistic work they had started. "You didn't die in vain," he said quietly, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced since childhood. The fraud the Blackwoods committed had been completely exposed, and the town they corrupted was being rebuilt on honest foundations. Carl realized the true tribute to his parents wasn't just avenging their deaths, but continuing to fight for the justice they defended in life. The crime that made him an orphan had transformed into a life mission that would give meaning to everything he went through. The anger he carried for 2 decades was finally transforming into purpose. His war against the injustice that shaped his entire life had found its final form. It wasn't about destroying enemies, but about building a better world. Carl left the cemetery knowing his parents would be proud not just of the justice he achieved, but mainly of the person he became in the process. Carl's story spread far beyond Millbrook, inspiring other people who suffered injustices not to give up the fight for truth. The investigation he conducted became a model of how a determined person can face corrupt systems and win. Universities began studying the case as an example of effective legal activism, and Carl received invitations to speak at conferences on social justice and fighting corruption. The fraud the Blackwoods perpetrated for decades had become a historical case of how organized crime can be dismantled through meticulous investigation and personal courage. The crime that cost his parents their lives had transformed into a lesson about the importance of never giving up the search for truth. The anger Carl felt for growing up an orphan was now channeled to inspire other orphans of injustice to fight for their rights. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life had become a force of social change that transcended his personal story. Carl discovered that the best way to honor his parents' memory was to use the pain they suffered to prevent other families from going through the same suffering, creating a legacy of justice that would last far beyond his own life. 5 years after the trial that changed Millbrook forever, Carl sat on the porch of the house he bought on the same street where his parents lived when he was a child. The investigation he conducted had transformed into a new life he never imagined possible. The law office he established in town became a national reference in corruption cases, and he received clients from across the country who needed someone with experience facing complex criminal schemes. The fraud the Blackwoods committed had been the springboard for a career dedicated to protecting the vulnerable against the powerful. Carl looked at the town he helped rebuild and felt satisfaction that went far beyond the revenge he initially sought. The crime that made him an orphan had transformed into a life mission that gave meaning to each day. The anger he carried for 20 years had been replaced by purpose and inner peace. His war against the injustice that shaped his entire life had evolved into a vocation that benefited not just him, but hundreds of other people who needed a defender. The truth he discovered about his parents had become the foundation of a life dedicated to the same values they defended. Millbrook was a completely different town now. The sustainable companies Carl and Rebecca established had created a prosperous and clean economy based on green technology and ecological tourism. The investigation Carl conducted had exposed not just crimes, but also the region's unexplored potential. The river the Blackwoods polluted for decades was clean again, and its banks had become a public park where families picnicked on weekends. The fraud the Blackwood family perpetrated for generations had been replaced by total transparency. All public contracts were available online, and City Hall Hall held monthly public hearings where any citizen could question government decisions. Carl walked through the streets and saw children playing in squares that used to be vacant lots, young people studying in schools equipped with modern technology, and elderly people enjoying a healthcare system that actually worked. The crime that cost his parents their lives had, paradoxically, resulted in a stronger and more just community. The anger he felt for growing up an orphan had transformed into a creative force that benefited an entire town. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life had become an example of how pain can be transformed into progress. Carl married Rebecca 3 years after the trial, in a simple ceremony at the local church that symbolized the union not just of two people, but of two families that had been separated by violence and reunited by justice. The investigation he conducted had created a partnership that evolved into genuine love and mutual respect. Rebecca had proven to be a woman of extraordinary courage, who sacrificed her own family inheritance to do the right thing. Together they adopted 2 orphaned children, giving them the stable home Carl never had. The fraud the Blackwood family committed had created victims, but now descendants of that same family were creating hope. Carl discovered that true redemption didn't come just from punishing the guilty, but from breaking the cycle of suffering they created. The crime that made him an orphan had taught him the value of family, and now he was building a new family based on love and justice. The anger he carried for 2 decades had been replaced by a love that extended not just to his wife and children, but to the entire community he helped rebuild. His war against the injustice that shaped his entire life had found its perfect conclusion, creating a new generation that would grow up in a more just world. The Whitfield Institute for Social Justice was established in the building where the old Blackwood factory operated, transforming a symbol of corruption into a center of education and activism. The investigation Carl conducted had become the basic curriculum of a program that taught young lawyers how to investigate and prosecute white-collar crimes. Students from across the country came to Millbrook to learn the techniques Carl developed, and many stayed in town to work at the office that expanded to meet growing demand. The fraud the Blackwoods perpetrated for decades had become study material that would help prevent similar crimes in other communities. Carl taught weekly classes at the Institute, sharing not just technical knowledge, but also the importance of never giving up the search for truth. The crime that cost his parents their lives had transformed into a school that would train a new generation of justice defenders. The anger he felt for growing up an orphan was being channeled to educate others who might face similar injustices. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life had evolved into an educational system that would perpetuate the fight for human rights far beyond his own life. Carl established an annual tradition in Millbrook, Truth Day, when the town celebrated not just the exposure of the Blackwoods crimes, but mainly the courage of all who fought for justice throughout history. The investigation he conducted had revealed that his parents weren't the only ones who tried to expose corruption. There were others over the years who were silenced or intimidated. The event honored all these people, creating a living memorial that inspired new generations never to accept injustice passively. The fraud the Blackwoods committed had created many victims, but Truth Day celebrated the community's resistance and resilience. Carl spoke every year at the event, telling his story not as a quest for revenge, but as an example of how persistence and courage can transform tragedy into triumph. The crime that made him an orphan had become part of a larger narrative about the importance of defending democratic values and human rights. The anger he carried for 20 years had been transformed into an annual celebration of good's victory over evil. His war against the injustice that shaped his entire life had become a community tradition that strengthened social bonds and inspired civic activism. Carl wrote a book about his experience titled The Price of Truth: A Journey from Orphan to Justice Defender. The investigation he conducted became an inspiring narrative that sold millions of copies and was translated into dozens of languages. The book wasn't just about exposing crimes, but about personal transformation, forgiveness, and building a better future on the ruins of the past. The fraud the Blackwoods perpetrated for decades became the backdrop of a universal story about the struggle between good and evil, justice and corruption. Carl donated all book royalties to the Whitfield Institute, ensuring his parents' story would continue inspiring future generations of activists. The crime that cost his parents their lives had become literature that educated and inspired people around the world. The anger he felt for growing up an orphan had been transformed into words that gave hope to others facing seemingly insurmountable injustices. His revenge against the injustice that shaped his entire life had found its final expression, a work that would perpetuate his parents' memory and the values they defended, ensuring their fight for truth would continue inspiring people long after he was no longer here to tell the story. Carl Edwards' journey from vengeful orphan to justice defender teaches us that pain can be transformed into purpose when channeled correctly. What began as a personal search for answers became a life mission that benefited an entire community. Carl discovered that true victory wasn't in destroying his enemies, but in building something better on the ruins they left behind. Millbrook's transformation from a corrupted town into an example of transparency and sustainable prosperity proves it's possible to rebuild on solid foundations, even when everything seems lost. Carl and Rebecca showed that even families most divided by violence can find redemption through justice and forgiveness. The Whitfield Institute continues training new defenders of truth, ensuring Sarah and David Whitfield's legacy lives forever. This story reminds us that true justice isn't just punishing the guilty, but also healing the wounds they caused and protecting others from suffering the same fate. Carl learned that carrying anger for decades doesn't bring peace. It only perpetuates the cycle of suffering. It was when he transformed his pain into constructive action that he found true redemption and managed to honor his parents' memory the way they deserved. This story shows that even in the most desperate situations, truth always finds a way to the light, and that one determined person can make a difference against an entire system of corruption. If this journey of transformation and justice touched your heart, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to fight for what's right. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of truth, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how courage can change the world.